Okay, so why do I think these videos are so interesting? Okay, so in a minute what we're going to see is the symphysis pubis, which is down here. We're going to see the sacrum. As I said, this is a person, they're lying on their back, so the back is over here, they're to the front. This is the bladder, which is obviously quite enlarged at this moment, but that's because they filled it up, obviously, or they've made the person wait before urinating, so that the bladder then stands proud to push the other organs or elevate them a bit for imaging purposes. We'll see that all of this is the intestinal mass, which is going to be having peristaltic activity all the time. And one of the things that it shows is that with that peristaltic activity, you can see that it would have a certain quality of feel. Now, as I might have said before, the MRI is taken as a series of slices, shots, a few seconds apart. So although the person is breathing quietly, all this peristalsis that is ongoing as they're going through that quiet respiration, but because of the way that they splice the video, it's then all a bit jittery and jolty and a bit quicker than it would ordinarily be. So just take that into account. But nonetheless, there is this constant activity in the intestines and also bladder and other organs all the time, or depending on the stage of filling with the bladder, but that's a separate talk. So we'll also then see the uterus, which is here. So we've got the vagina there, uterus here, falling forwards in its anteverted position in this video. It's resting on the back of the rectum, which is over here. And what we'll also be able to see is the actual uterine peristalsis, which will occur down here. So we'll get that video playing. So it's on a bit of a loop, so it will just keep going. And the first thing that you can be struck by is literally all of that intestinal activity. It's just going around its business, digesting away, being active, reactive, sort of vital and coordinated and easy. So as you put your hands on, that's going to have a certain feel. When you push your hands through the abdominal wall, initially you're going to give mechanical signaling into the gut. The gut may well react, and depending on its status, it may react a lot or a little, or etc. But you're going to have this feel. So rather than worrying about where the ligaments are and all of that silly old nonsense, it's more of a qualitative physiological interpretation as is the gut mass behaving easily, effectively, etc. We can also see here between the intestines and the bladder a nice slip-slide surface. So you remember in the other in vivo video, that shiny surface, the intestines just slip over around there, as does the uterus over the surface of the bladder. And again, as the uterus falls forwards and the intestines falls on the back of the uterus, then again on this posterior surface, you've got this nice separate slip slide with the organs all doing all their bits and bobs. You can see here some of the organs creeping down into what is going to be the pouch of Douglas at the rear of the sacrum and at rear of the uterus, rather, in front of the rectum. And so sometimes in cases of prolapse, as the uterus moves down, more and more organs then crowd into that pouch of Douglas and prevent elevation. But we'll come back to prolapse later. But yes, so now look here. Can you see that? There we go. Anyway, uterine peristalsis, which is hormonally driven, or it will alter its rate and rhythm according to the different times of the month, or with respect to sexual activity or orgasm. And so you have a variety of different levels of activity in there, depending on when you evaluate it, or if there's a pathology present, and so on. So that's normal. That's how it should be, feel, seem, or appear when you explore it hands-on, etc. So now I've got another video. Now this video, as I say, when you get to the website, Mr. Fujiwara and his article, there are a number of videos that you can download. We're going to have a look now at the one with endometriosis. So this person has not only endometriosis and therefore some adhesions as a result of that, they also have a severe retroversion and so on. So let's just have a little bit of a look at that one. Instantly, The intestines look different. Now, there's nothing wrong with her intestines. She didn't have an intestine problem, but she may well have functional disturbance simply because of the presence of these two adhesions, which they have marked out with the arrows. Now, unfortunately, I can't move those arrows because they're embedded in the video, but here's one, and you can see how the surface of the bladder is peaked up. So instead of being that sort of flatter, easier surface, now the bladder is peaked up. So the muscular coat and the mechanoreceptors in the bladder wall are clearly going to be adapted or have different sensory input based on the presence of that physical tethering. Also, you can see here that with the uterus flipped back, now on the ventral surface of the uterus, which should be touching the bladder, but isn't, it's now obviously got lots of intestines in the way. There's an adhesion there, which again, you can see is impacting on the whole of that global intestinal visceral mass activity. So it's not just the one little tiny zone here causing an adhesion and the rest is normal. It changes the dynamic across the whole of the intestinal mass. With the uterus now in its posterior position, now we don't know if this is congenital or acquired, but at this stage it doesn't matter, but we can just see that the whole uterus itself just is not expressing itself as fully as the other uterus. Now we don't know what time of the month her cycle is at, but it just does not look overall as healthy. And for us, the thing is, when you put your hands on that, qualitatively, it's immediately not going to be the same sort of tissue vitality and activity. That would be the point. So your diagnostic criteria is not whether it's left or right or which ligament here or there or whatever. Where's your local listening? It's got nothing to do with any of that. It's a qualitative physiological perspective on the level of normal or abnormal condition of the organs and a physiological expression. So we can immediately see, oh, something's not right. You've got no idea what is wrong or not right, but you can tell that it's not as it could be or should be. But so for all of those reasons, I just really like these series of videos because they're just so informative. And although we're not talking about prolapse at the moment, I will just play the cystocele one. So this is a bladder prolapse. I'll explain all of that separately. And now, older woman, I think she's in her 70s. She has a peak-shaped bladder. She's doing a Valsalva maneuver. I'll come back to that. But this peak-shaped bladder is because in part the bladder is dropped. So it is a cystocele, and she also has a uterine displacement. But you can see that because this bladder is distorted, it has a funny shape. So again, mechanistically, it's not going to be performing appropriately. And as she does her Valsalva, this is her uterus, slight retroversion or slight verticality, and you can see that her vagina is and the whole bulging is coming way below the level of the symphysis pubis as she does that. So that is just not something. And you can see how all of the viscera are employed in that inferior displacement. So you can't just push it up and make it stay there, because all of these other cavity dynamics are clearly now compromising the whole dynamic. So there's a few little videos for you to hopefully set the scene on some stuff. So when one does all of these techniques that we've been, introducing, and we can practice separately, etc. It's the qualitative perspective as much as the quantitative perspective. And that when you do I do so much functional, as in inverted commas, as in I do a combined where I search for a barrier, I recognize the quality of the barrier, I may back out of the barrier faintly, and I may migrate around the barrier in a semi-ease direction, searching for ease, but I push into ease. I make it go to ease. I don't sit there hands off, hands out, observing and not engaging and observing and following. I don't do that. I push in. So that's a philosophical decision. But all the time, instead of listening just for the mechanistic barrier, and there are barriers there, so I move here, I look for qualitative change. So as I move into the tissue, does the quality change? And what responsivenesses do I get? And with that responsiveness, is that adverse or more, hopefully calm, qualitatively easy, or more, hopefully, hypothetically, physiologically efficient? Then I use that as my determinant of direction, as in qualitative response, not not a mechanical barrier per se. So all of the unwinding that one does, one then clearly it's not specifically in relation to, there's no direction that one should move a thing in. Because if one focuses only on direction, you're then missing the orientation and neural sensitivity, mechanosensitivity in the organ that is giving you feedback. So essentially you're working with this internal sensory milieu as you're working with your hands, and that's what's going to give them some hopeful change of tissue functionality after. So we revisited essentially these techniques, then looking with the hands to help have this three-dimensional qualitative perspective. And we again drew the attention back to the fact that, okay, you can just have, if you like, your abdominal hand as the monitoring hand, and then you can move larger external structures such as the ilium to introduce change through all these connections, such that you don't have to keep probing the viscera. You can monitor and you can orient around using more global body contacts or more diffuse visceral contacts to ease the visceral mass with you, so that the actual interruption and direct stimulus at the perhaps most irritated foci can be necessarily and usefully less, so that you can be monitoring and the other hand can be active, as opposed to having to monitor and be active with the same hand on tissues which may be too sensitive to respond sensibly or give you good communicative feedback for your technique. So we did some techniques then, obviously thinking about these issues. So we revised this three-dimensional bimanual front and back, or otherwise combined technique approaches. And so that is essentially the end of the day 2, where we've looked at the cavity, how the cavity reacts with the contents, how you have these internal interoceptive dynamics in the cavity, which the global cavity is hopefully going to work with you with. And we then looked at some fluid mechanics and fluid dynamics, and that the idea is to get the cavity as a whole moving so that the fluid moves, which is physiologically important. And then we worked on understanding some of the interfaces in this zone. And as we got down into the pelvic bowl, this difference between the broad ligament interface and then the levator ani interface and then the orificial dynamics, and then putting all of that together with this qualitative three-dimensional multi-systemed dynamic, which essentially has to have a lot of crosstalk in it and between it, and within also the somatic system viscerosomatically as well as visceroviscerally, in order to ensure that this whole movement dynamic is as it could be. And then various techniques to do with that. So that gives us the end of day 2.